Is a professor at Hamline University, a professor in the business school and the law school, and the director of conflict studies. It so happened that he and I ended up at Hamline at the same time in 1996, so we've known each other for a long time and have maintained, even though he stayed and I only lasted 1 year.
Which shows his good judgment to continue growing and moving on.
And his persistence. We have maintained contact because we have lots of the same interests and the same sense of humor. So we have lunch every once in a while. And when we were doing this, I knew that Ken had been involved in, because we talked about it at lunch a few times, in Middle East conflict. I didn't know how involved he'd been, and so I suggested that he might be a good person to come and talk to us about his experiences. So he did that last week, and this week you are going to do, and I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jack. I'll do a thumbnail. So the U.S. State Department has had various programs in the Middle East for many, many years. And at the end of the Oslo Peace Accord, Congress set aside a pot of money to try and build relationships between Israeli and Palestinian local leaders and citizens. And there were two people in particular, the Deputy Minister of Education in the Labor government in Israel and the Dean of Graduate Education at the University in Gaza City, who had developed a relationship. And they were actually encouraged to develop a project together. But one of the requirements that Congress had was that there had to be a U.S. partner, nonprofit, to serve as fiscal agent and then also to be a partner. And through some coincidence, they connected with a colleague of mine at Hamline. And so we started working with them in 1996. And that evolved over the next number of years into 4 separate multi-year State Department funded projects that focused first on curriculum development in middle schools in Gaza and in southern Israel, and then expanded to high school curriculum development across Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and we were encouraged to add Jordanian schools, the Jordan Valley, and Lebanon. That then evolved into teacher training institutes for the same 4 communities: Gaza, West Bank, Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon. And then with some policy changes in the U.S. government over the last 5 or 6 years, we were then encouraged to develop economic-based programs in the same communities. So we worked across the whole region. And there was a period of about, I'd say at least 12 years where we were we had active projects running, and we were going over there and we were bringing people here and back and forth. The last project that we put in for funding was just 2 years ago. It was not ultimately funded. It was, the name of it has sort of a catchy, I don't know how seriously catchy, but a catchphrase called Hands and Horses Across Borders. We worked with an equine therapist, and we identified a location on the West Bank that is on the green line between Israel and the West Bank, 2 villages that touch. And we've done this kind of work before. And the plan was to build an equine therapy center for children who were impacted by the trauma of the conflict. And it would be both Israeli and Palestinian children. And then we would train Israeli and Palestinian equine therapists to work with them. And our whole model is concentric circles. You take a presenting problem and then you work through the community outward. So we would first train staff and then work with the schools to provide support systems to these kids. And by working with the schools, we would then have entree into the local government leadership and ultimately involve the communities as an entirety. And this last grant was not directly through the State Department. It was a USAID grant that we put in for. That was not funded last year. We may put in for that again. So we do a variety of things. And as I mentioned last week, although some of the activities that we do are different, there is a common thread that runs through all of our work. And that is to look at some of the foundational challenges of engaging in peace-building work. And from our perspective, among the biggest challenges are cognitive development is not the right way to say it, but worldview, critical thinking, and the ability to conceptualize other in a way that allows room for coexistence. So in the curriculum work, in the educational work, all of our activities, the lesson plans, the business plans, everything involved deconstructing and reconstructing conceptions of self and other through identity. In the school projects, I didn't mention this last week, in the school projects, another critical challenge that we faced was the evidence that is used to support the curricula. For example, lesson plans where you have a Palestinian school and an Israeli school that are talking about the history of the region. And in the textbooks of the two schools, there will be reference to the same piece of ground. And in the Israeli textbook, it will have the ancient Israeli name of the town, that goes back thousands of years. And in the Palestinian textbook, for the same piece of dirt, will have the Palestinian or Arabic name and history with two very different narratives. And the challenge is when you have different fact bases to support an explanation for what you consider to be true, that leads to impasse in being able to talk about anything because you don't even have a common language, even if you're speaking the same language. We also had to deal with, and this is in the popular press more, we also had to deal with some relatively extreme examples of hatred that were embedded in the textbooks. And this is, I'm not going to use this example to point fingers because you can find examples on both sides, but in a math book in one of the Palestinian schools, one Jew kills 3 Palestinians, how many people are left? And this is in the official textbooks, this kind of thing. So you have vehicles to promote hatred and deepen an extremist narrative that's embedded in a developmental document. So part of the work that we did was to try to just serve as editors and kind of call out what we, and as Americans, we are not neutral. We have our own partisan views. But to at least sort of name things as, okay, let's revisit this one. Let's revisit that one. Let's, those kinds of things. So to try and take some of the venom out of documents. And if you think about it, and again, I'm not pointing to one community or another, but if you think about it, you have 10, 11, 12-year-olds who, as part of the fabric of their education, as they learn about the world, I mean, think about what we've had to do in the U.S. to address the bigotry in our own textbooks and the racism and prejudice in our own textbooks here in the U.S. So it's not unique. But when your worldview is very deeply embedded in a very specific view that excludes other, you have to go pretty deep if you're going to try and have generational influence. So those were the kinds of things that we did. Well, good morning again for those who I got to meet last week, and nice to meet those of you who are new. Just a little bit of context. Lydia and Jack and Adam and I had a couple of lunch conversations as we were thinking about what these two visits might look like. And our thinking was that the first visit last week, I would talk about my own experience working on these various projects in the Middle East, and that this week we might have more of an open conversation about things that are of interest to all of you. And so I just want to be transparent about that I'm not I've not planned to talk for an hour. I mean, last week I think I ran up like I had gave you guys like 4 minutes or something at the end. That my thought for this morning is to really not facilitate for you, but for us together to have a more open conversation about whether it's Middle East justice or your own interest or whatever. So just so you're not surprised when I start getting really quiet and go, well, what do you think and all that. And if that doesn't work for you, we can sort out what would be valuable time for all of you. So last week, for those who weren't here last week I talked a little bit about these projects that a group of us at Hamlin and I worked on it was actually from 1996 up until just now, but really there was about a 12-year period when we were very active working in the region and working with partners. And we still have our partners, we just don't have the funding. We're between gigs, as they say, as we wait for new grant money to come out. But one of the things that sort of I thought about, and as the four of us spoke, Lydia and Jack and Adam and I, it was sort of what draws a person to do this kind of work. And that becomes very personal in some ways, very individual. But there also can be certain unifying reasons why people do work. And last week I talked about what drew me. I talked a little bit about my own Jewish identity, the family that I grew up in. And I'm now, I'll take a couple minutes just to kind of frame things, sort of prime the pump, and then we'll have a conversation. I'm now, my wife and I, Rhonda and I, are now facing a challenge that we weren't sure we would ever face. We have 3 children, as I've mentioned several times, all of them in their 20s. And for us, one of our greatest hopes was that our children would want to identify with the Jewish community and would want to be involved in sort of social action and social justice. And they have more than satisfied us. And not that they need to satisfy us. I mean, we're very proud of our kids. Except their view on the Middle East is different than Rhonda and mine. And so now we're faced with how do we have difficult conversations in our own family around what does justice mean, and what's the right thing to do when you're sitting in Minnesota or in Washington or in Boston or in Santa Cruz to try and make the world a better place, try to do good works. And so this is a very real and present issue for me as well, and my wife, and our kids, in terms of our own sense of what does it mean to try and do good. And for those who may be familiar with some of the Jewish traditions, one of the central Jewish values is called tikkun olam in Hebrew, to heal the world, an obligation to make the world a better place. And what does that look like, especially in a region that you may care very deeply about for your own personal reasons, moral reasons, identity reasons, but that is troubling on many different levels. So that's a challenge that I continue to struggle with. As I thought a little bit about sort of ways to weigh into the conversation, I don't recall, someone mentioned embodiment last week, and I don't remember if was she. She's not here today. I was struck by that, the term embodiment, because one of the things that causes me to ask, sort of, why do I do things? Well, how do you answer the question of why you get involved? Is to think about the various dimensions of being involved. And it's actually a piece that I wrote about a few years ago, but in terms of thinking of being reflective, being introspective about why you do what you do, there are multiple layers. And I thought that maybe this could be a little bit of a framework for conversation, but I leave it to you. If it doesn't work, we can do something else. So when I think about how to be reflective, how to develop greater awareness of why I'm involved, why I'm committed in different things, I think in terms of 3 layers: awareness of self, awareness of other at a more individual level, and also kind of conceptually other, and awareness of social context. So there are these 3 layers of awareness that I feel like I need to try and grapple with. Am I in touch with what motivates me? Am I in touch with what matters to me? Do I know how to be sensitive and aware of others and the impact that I have on them when I think I'm doing the right thing? Am I, what is it, Baby Huey? The cartoon, it's a cartoon character that's this lovable baby that's like 7 feet tall and breaks china closets and does damage, but totally innocently. So do I do that? When I think I'm doing good works, am I actually making things more complicated? And then the awareness of context is recognizing that we all function in a social context. We don't function in a vacuum. And so when you're doing social justice work, what does that look like? Especially when it's a politically charged, highly complex set of issues like the Middle East. And then the other way that I think about this awareness or this reflective work, so you've got these layers, trying to be in touch with ourselves, trying to be in touch with other, trying to be in touch with the larger context. Then there's sort of a cross-cut that goes the other way, and one is sort of an intellectual awareness, sort of how do I think about this issue? There is an emotional awareness, and this is what struck me from the embodiment comment from last week. There's also, you could say, a physiological or an embodied, a whole self-awareness, including our own physical kind of way of reacting to different issues or different ways of connecting to people. And as I think about that framework, and I think last week I mentioned that our group had a lot of some very heated discussions about what's the right thing to do in the Middle East and with our projects. I realized that the intellectual dimension of awareness, a lot of that relates to trying to sort out what my assumptions and belief systems are about what is true and what is just and what is real. And then on the emotional level, what is it what drives me? Why am I taking time away from my family? Why am I doing the things that I'm doing in my free time? So what I'm trying to do with this is just sort of break out some of these dimensions of reflective work. And then circling it back around to the lunch conversations that I had a chance to have with the planners for today, it made me curious. I mean, I don't know a lot about what you have been doing. I mean, the group has told me, and it sounds like very committed work, and it made me curious. What draws you to want to be actively involved in something that is thousands and thousands of miles away and different cultural contexts and so on? So, yeah. So, yeah.
Who finances the schools in Gaza, for instance?
That's a good question. The government finance. Well, there are governments. There are government, and then there are private finance schools. And the question of government is a little bit tricky. And I don't know enough. I can speak to past years. I don't know whether Hamas is funding all of the schools or some of the schools. I don't know whether Fatah, I mean, and these are partisan groups. The Palestinian Authority, I believe, officially is funding the schools in Gaza. But the question then is, what does that mean in practice? And again, so that I'm not sort of pointing fingers, because one of the things I mentioned last week is everybody is a victim and everyone is a perpetrator at some level. So it's really challenging to talk about such an inflamed place without seeming to take sides, right? I mean, it's just very challenging. If you have a community that is ostensibly under the control of a formal government shell, but on the ground, the reality is that political partisans are controlling what goes on the street, then you may have funding from an organization that sort of gets it's cleared, it's okay. But the teachers know very well where the real power base is. And in a lot of conversations we had, and I will say this was more so with the Palestinian teachers than with the Israeli teachers, they knew what was okay and not okay to say. And that was less related to where the money came, where the official came from, and more what was happening more locally. So, for example, we had to get, we got permission from the governments on both sides. I didn't meet with Yasser Arafat, but our directors met directly with him. And after he died, we met with the new head of the Palestinian Authority, and I was in groups that met with. So there was a lot of support, not just for us, for thousands of projects like this. But what was interesting to us was, how is the support conveyed? Is it support that could be openly discussed, or is it support that had to be kept under the radar? And we got different messages from different communities. How much of what we did was okay to be public about? So the entire first project, which was a 2 or 3 year project, we talked about as the quiet project. We couldn't even talk about it at Hamlin, because the curriculum writers, primarily on the Palestinian side because of the Intifada, the curriculum writers were afraid that if word came back and they were labeled as collaborators with the enemy, they might either be in danger physically, but more likely they would lose access to economic channels. They'd lose a job, or their kids would suddenly find out that they're not invited to be part of this school. So there are a lot of ways that communities can exert pressure, whether you call it intimidation or otherwise. And again, it's not unique to the Palestinian side, Israel, whatever. I would say that this is a human problem. People are very resilient to navigate forward in a way where they can survive. And the challenge is how to carve a safe space so that communities are not just surviving. They're able to engage more deeply in a purposeful, intentional, constructive way forward.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Those of us who probably aren't going to carry the flag and solve the problem in the Middle East, and we never will, we sort of adopt this slogan, think locally, be concerned about it, but act locally.
Right.
And a number of years ago, when the Irish Protestant and Catholic anger was at its fiercest, we brought children here from Ireland during the summer violence period to get away from the violence.
That's right.
And they had summers in Minnesota, summers at camp, summer.
Yep.
I've got to think that helped.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very good memory. The Seeds of Peace Project out of Maine did that. And actually, what's Bernie's last name? He teaches at St. Thomas. He was involved. He was the head of the Northern Ireland Children's Organization. Yeah, very much so.
So I'm wondering, is there a lesson there? Could we bring children here, maybe just start with Palestinian children, to say you can see a society where Jewish people and others are all working together, participating, making a society work. They're not all evil.
Well, that certainly fits with what we believed in our projects. That one of the things that we did was we brought groups here to work together, and not to model, not because Minnesota's the ideal model, but it's shocking what we take for granted here is so dramatic to someone who lives in a segregated world. One of the things that you can tell from the way we organized our projects, we focused on generational change. Not that we gave up on the adults, because then we'd be giving up on ourselves. But a worldview, once it gets settled in as an adult, it's a little harder to change. My narrative is set. And, as we talk, I'm filtering your thoughts through my own worldview and vice versa. But with kids, there's a different sense of hope.
Let me ask my question now, because I think it's relevant. There are ways in which you are different from us because of your Jewish background.
Yeah.
But I think there are many more ways in which you're similar because we're Americans, albeit you're a Californian.
Well, I was hoping not to have that revealed, but I've been outed.
So
Yay!
So especially with that hat on,
Yeah.
what assumptions did you bring to your experiences, your on-the-ground experiences in the Middle East? What assumptions did you bring to those experiences that were most challenged by what you saw and observed?
Well, one of the things that challenged me, Israel is about the size of this coffee table for any of you who've been there. And it is just as diverse and just as complex and just as varied as any community anywhere. As is true, I'm sure, Palestinian communities and Arab communities. And the complexity of Israeli society blew me away. I thought, okay, I'm going to be among my Jewish friends, and of course we're going to do things exactly the way I did in my Reform synagogue in California, that kind of stuff. And so that shocked me. One thing that struck me or strikes me, and I don't know whether this goes to culture or strategy or what, but when a conflict happens, like a terrible event happens, someone's shot or a bomb goes off on a bus someplace, I noticed that the communities dealt with those events in different ways. the Israeli community that I know and in the press is very stoic and doesn't disclose a lot of what happens. And I don't know. I don't want to overgeneralize. So this is my narrative. If you think of, well, no. As I think of Jewish history, it's very easy. In fact, we joke about it in Sunday school when we grow up. The history of Judaism is the history of victimization. So it's real easy. I mean, that you can say that. It's an oversimplification. But it's very easy to tell. We go from one tragedy to the next. What's Hanukkah? Oh, they tried to annihilate us and the oil didn't go out. You know, what's this? Oh, they tried to. I mean, so there's sort of this narrative that is easy with Jewish identity to think of Jewish history as an oppressed community. And my instinct is that Israeli psyche is one, no, we are not going to be anybody's victim anymore. Including, we're not going to put out in the press how many people are killed and how many people are injured. And the press that relates to other communities may see it differently. There may be a strategic value in talking about how many people are harmed. So there are these asymmetries culturally in terms of self-identity and other identity that are still a little bit confusing to me, but that's something that completely surprised me, which tells me that what I'm reading in the newspaper, I have no idea how much of it is accurate. I'm sure that what is in the press is true, but what I don't know is whether that truth is 5% of the whole story, or 90% of the whole story, or 75% of one story and 0% of it. I mean, it causes me to not disbelieve what I read, but to read, not with a jaundiced view, but to be a little more circumspect when I read what's going on.